unfortunately, Delta has a beautiful direct flight.
They canceled that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
They said, I think the last I read was March or April. They may reinstate it.
Oh, that would be amazing.
And I took it this year. It was great. Got on the plane, got off the plane, I was home.
Yeah, I took that flight twice.
Yeah, it's much easier.
Yeah,
Your beautiful daughter, Sarah, and her husband, are they in Israel?
they are. Yeah, they're doing very well, thank God. God.
She looked like she did.
Yeah. Her Hebrew name actually means princess. So, good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? 12/31/23. Is that part of the numerology?
That's great.
Is that so?
It's the 31st.
Wow, Mazel Tov.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2,
Good.
3.
Yes.
It's supposed to be some kind of magic.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay, I didn't think about that.
I saw that on the news. Magic.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's get busy. Let's go. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So maybe as we leave 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 24 is going to be a year where things get done. Is that so? It's a Jewish leap year, I can tell you that. Yeah.
Years.
Yes, actually, the Christmas was actually on Monday, Wednesday next year. So we jumped the whole entire day. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
That's like I'm always gonna be.
Yeah.
But I don't so that the whole entire day.
Fantastic.
Yeah, every year, like New Year's falls, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 4 years skips out. So it's like,
Wonderful.
Seriously, Rabbi, I went back and reread this essay. It was on the first front page of Kaballah.org. And I remember the information. It had to do with 17 years here and 17 years here, and added up to 34, which is the numerical value of the name. But anyway, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with that. I don't want any spiritual message from numerology. Maybe I just don't get it.
Let me set the stage for today's discussion, and then we'll take your question, and then we'll try to navigate this. So, we are beginning a new semester, if you would, a new season here at the Intown Jewish Academy. January, February, March is going to welcome a bunch of new programs and new some special lectures, Shabbatons. We're hoping for an email to go out tomorrow or Tuesday. I'm back teaching Kaballah and Coffee. We're going to be doing a discourse on Israel, understanding the holiness of the land of Israel. And there's much to explore there, but we're going to be exploring that. And so please spread the word. You'll get the emails. Please share the emails with others and social media posts and so on. For today, I wanted to kind of just, because I figured that a lot of people would not be here today because of the season, football, that's it. I figured we'd open up the floor just for open discussion. I have something to share if we run out of discussion, but I suspect that we won't run out of discussion. But let's kind of open up the floor. You had a question, and then let's hear your question, then I'll address maybe some of the things that you mentioned.
Actually, wrote down a question.
Okay.
What spiritual benefit am I supposed to get from numerology?
Okay. Is your question related to that?
Who's there?
Different. Okay. So, yes, please.
I'm not mistaken that the code from 15 years ago that was largely
Aish Torah codes, Aish Torah popularized it, yeah.
sort of debunked. What is about those codes? And I think it's related to numerology in a way.
Okay, so I would actually separate the codes from, well, I'm not going to call it numerology. I'm going to call it by the Hebrew word, because I think that numerology connotes a lot of galaxy, stars, constellation kind of stuff, which is not that none of it has its origins in Jewish teachings, but a lot of it is not founded in Jewish teachings. I'm going to use the Hebrew word, which is gematria. And that's different than the codes, as I'll elaborate in a moment. But let's first kind of establish what is gematria. So gematria is the Hebrew, each letter in the Hebrew alphabet has a numerical value to it. The first 10 letters are 1 through 10. Then we go into 20s, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 till 90. Then we have 100, 200, 300, and 400. And that's where it stops. So to do 500, or if you want to do the thousands, you use, if you're writing as a number, as a digit number, as opposed to a spelled out number, right? In Hebrew, you can write chamesh elef, which means 5,000. But if you want to write it as a number, you would actually use the fifth letter of the alphabet, hey, you put an apostrophe after it, and that makes whatever follows to be 5,000. Okay? Or you combine 100 and 400 to make 500, right? If you're spelling it that way. So there's a lot of different ways. So for example, this year is 5784. It's spelled hey for the 5,000. Then you have tuf and shin, which is 400 and 300, which makes the 700. Then you have the pei, which is 80, and you have daled, which is 4. So hey, tuf, shin, pei, daled spells 5784. It's not important to get that 100% right now, but I'm just setting the stage for that. And in certain contexts, people will identify different verses in the Torah and different Hebrew sayings and figure out their numeric value, and they would apply that numeric value to other parallels. There's a book called Gematrion, which gives you, if you're looking for good, cute sermon material, you can find something that's relevant to the Torah portion, or if you're celebrating the wedding of an individual or a bar bat mitzvah, and you can take their Hebrew name and you find the numeric value and you find some Hebrew saying that parallels, and it all becomes very cute and nice and touching. But that doesn't make it holy per se. Okay. So in order for a gematria to carry specific value, it has to be something that we have a tradition around. And the tradition has to come from a good source. Who's a good source? The Talmud, the Mishnah, the Talmud, rabbis who we consider to have divine intuition, mystical leaders, and so on. So that's a prerequisite. Just because you come up with a number that feels good doesn't make it holy, and therefore doesn't compel us to extrapolate any deep meaning from it. Before I go to the specific question, there's a very fascinating. I'm going to tell you why gematria is so important. This is also, even with holy sources, you can be, okay, what's the big deal? It's just a number game. So in Tanya, in the section known as Shar HaYichud VeEmunah, the portal of unity and faith, the Alter Rebbe tells us that the Baal Shem Tov teaches that it says, La'olam Hashem Dvarcha Nitzav B'Shamayim. Forever, God, your words stand in the heaven. And that is that the 10 utterances, which we read about at the beginning of Bereshis, at the beginning of Genesis, that God used to create the world, right? We've discussed many times that the creation comes into being through speech, through divine speech. Like it says, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or, and God said, let there be light. Or Vayomer Elokim Yehi Rakia, and God said, let there be a firmament, right? There are 10 such utterances. The Talmud tells us that the opening verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is also one of the 10 utterances. So we have 10 utterances, that these actual Hebrew letters, right? These actual Hebrew letters are the channels through which existence is sustained, through which existence comes into being, and through which existence is sustained. So you might say that just as the electric current is what gives the light its light, right? And just like the energy of our cells is what energizes our body, the words that God uttered is what gives all of existence its life, its life force, its very existence, not just its energy, but its actual existence. That is to say that if God were to hold back that life force, he would hold back that energy, the world would revert to nothingness. It's not going to slowly, it's not like a machine that doesn't have a motor or a car that doesn't have gas. It just would cease to be, because the very existence of the thing itself is dependent on the word of Hashem, the word of God that energizes it. And these aren't words that were just uttered 5,784 years ago, but as we say in the prayers every single day, he renews in his goodness every single day, constantly, the works of creation. In other words, God is constantly, every millisecond, that's on human terms, but whatever that means in above time beingness, God is constantly re-uttering those 10 utterances. The creation is constantly being recreated every moment, which is a very powerful concept, very powerful messaging about our lives. Sometimes we carry around baggage from yesterday, and the reality is that yesterday doesn't exist anymore. And this moment never existed before. We are in an entirely new world this moment. So whatever happened before is irrelevant. I don't mean it's entirely irrelevant, but we're not compelled by it. We're completely open. We have the capacity to be completely open to the possibilities that are in front of us at this very moment, because this moment didn't exist before. It's not a continuation. It's a brand new moment. So, and the Baal Shem Tov continues that these 10 utterances by which God created, they become the life force because each object in creation has a Hebrew name, and its Hebrew name is what gives it its energy. So if you look at the 10 utterances, you're not going to find that many things uttered in the 10 utterances. Some of them are very general things, like the firmament, like light, like trees and grass. But there's no glasses in the 10 utterances. There's no coffee in the 10 utterances, which is really potentially a devastating piece of news. L'chaim. Catastrophic. So how do these things that are not uttered there come into being and sustain? So the Alter Rebbe tells us that every Hebrew letter, as it descends into this world, has many iterations. And these are the iterations that are formulated through various different methods of extrapolating the Hebrew alphabet, including, the Alter Rebbe quotes, there's something known as Atbash, Aleph Taf, Beis Shin, which means the first letter of the alphabet and the last letter of the alphabet are interchangeable. The second one and the second to last are interchangeable, and so on. So you have relationships between letters like that. You have relationships between letters. There are 5 ways to pronounce Hebrew letters. And so all of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet belong to one of 5 families, and all the letters in a given family are interchangeable. And there the Alter Rebbe says that one of the methods as well through which letters are manifest are through gematria. So that you can have the gematria of a particular word that is uttered in the 10 utterances that parallels the Hebrew name that something that's not uttered in the 10 utterances equals. And that, therefore, that utterance becomes the life force for that particular object. Now, we don't necessarily have to figure out exactly what belongs to which family and exactly which of the 10 utterances brought the particular object into being. That's beyond, it's probably ultimately beyond human capacity to actually figure that all out. But there are things that have been passed down to us in our tradition that help draw those parallels. So I wanted to share that because I think it's important that it's not just a numbers game. It's not just a cute thing, although it can be used that way, but there's actually really profound, essential life force that's carried in gematria. So when it is being taught to us from a legitimate source, it's worth paying attention to and asking the question, what am I to learn from this? And I don't know the specific reference in terms of 34, but 34 is 2 times 17. And the 17 is what's referenced in the opening of the Parsha, where it tells us, the Parsha that we read yesterday, Vayechi, it says that Yaakov lived 17 years in the land of Egypt. And one of the Rebbes teach us that the number 17 is the same gematria as the word tov, which means good or best. Tes is 9, Vav is 6, Vet is 2. So we have 17. And this particular Rebbe, I think it was the Tzemach Tzedek, says that the best years of Yaakov's life were lived in Egypt. So what does that mean? What's the messaging there? So in fact, one of the later Rebbes posed the question. Egypt was known to be the most lowly and immoral of lands. The Torah calls it Ervas Haaretz, which means Erva is a word which is hard to translate. It means it's a reference to immorality, sexual immorality. And so Egypt represented like the most base of people at the time. And yet it was specifically in this land of Egypt that Jacob celebrated the best years of his life. Now, on a technical level, we see why. Jacob's life was fraught with difficulty. He was pursued by his brother. He was pursued by his father-in-law. He lost his wife, his young wife. He had, and then the whole deal with Joseph came along. Finally, at the end of his life, he comes to Egypt, and he can finally rest. The last 17 years of his life were fairly peaceful. He enjoyed his children, he enjoyed his grandchildren, he enjoyed his great-grandchildren. It was a good life. They lived in Goshen. They lived in a Jewish community. Things were good. Joseph provided for them. They didn't have any financial worries. So on a very technical level, it seems like it was a good life, but it still begs the question, how could you say that spiritually, Jacob's all about spirituality, how could you say that Jacob's best years were in Egypt? So in the prior Torah portion, in Vayigash, the Torah tells us that Jacob sent Judah ahead to show the way to Goshen, which is where they were going to settle. So the word lehoros, you listen closely, horos sounds like Torah, because the root word is the same. They both mean to teach. And Rashi comments that Jacob sent Yehuda to establish a yeshiva. That even before the Jewish people came down to Egypt, they already established a place of study, which is a very powerful lesson about life, right? That as a people, that we are completely dependent on Torah. And when we lose our anchoring, everything gets into trouble. So even before the Jewish people came into exile, even before they came into this place called Egypt, they already established a place of Torah study from which they were going to be able to anchor themselves in that in the tradition of their fathers. So the Rebbe answers that because there was a place of Torah study and Torah shows the way, therefore Jacob's best years were in this environment of Torah study, even though it was in Egypt. So the takeaway for us in terms of lessons is that we as a people are dependent on the Torah. And oftentimes, I referenced this in my sermon yesterday, that oftentimes we become we become distracted by a lot of voices out in the world, right? The stuff that we're facing, the challenges that we're facing, the world puts forth all kinds of rationalizations and justifications and so on. And if we want to know how to look at the world, we have to look at Torah. Torah is what teaches us how to look at the world. Torah is the lenses through which we look at the world. And whenever we're not wearing those glasses, either because we took them off or because we didn't put them on, our vision is askewed. And therefore, Jacob said, we're going into Egypt, we're going into a state of exile. We need to have clear glasses. We need to be deeply anchored in Torah in order to empower us to be able to see our way in the darkness of the world. And I think that message is as powerful today as it's ever been.
Refinement.
Yeah.
Or some world.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. It's a hard question to answer. The way I understand it is that our forefathers were mystics. In other words, they had access to deeper dimensions. And we discussed, I remember maybe last year before Rosh Hashanah, we had a discourse where we talked about how divine energy, as it descends, it takes on different form. So even the Torah, as we read it in the 5 books of Moses, is a different form than it is in its origin. It's the same Torah, but it's the parallel that I use is the idea of an intellectual idea, an invention that starts off as brain matter, right? That ultimately becomes some kind of physical object. The brain matter, in a sense, is in the object, and the object was in the brain. Even though neither the brain matter is physically in the object nor the physical object was in the brain, but you can absolutely categorically say that the brain matter is in the object and the object was in the brain, because the object is a direct descendant of what the inventor was thinking, and the object as it is what the inventor had in his brain before the object came into being. So in a sense, the Torah, as we know it, as we read the stories, as we read the laws of the Torah, they manifest themselves in higher dimensions in a different dimension. And our forefathers studied the Torah in those dimensions. It says that the souls studied Torah in the Garden of Eden. I recently studied a discourse where certain mitzvahs in the Torah that we study on a human level, the way they're studied in the Garden of Eden represent a spiritual analysis of things that are going on in the mystical worlds. And then there are layers in this particular discourse. It talks about how Torah is studied in the world of Bria, in the world of creation, and how that idea is studied in the world of Asiya, in this physical world, how that idea is studied in the world of Bria, in the world of creation, and how that same idea is studied in the world of Atzilus, the world of emanation. So you have the same idea. So that's just a glimpse of how we see a concept studied on different dimensions. That's how I imagine our forefathers having studied the Torah. Now, some of it manifested itself in practice, as we know that Abraham ate matzah, right? That's what he served the angels. So there was the concept of matzah. There was prayer, Shachris Mincha Ma'ariv, prayed by our forefathers. We have Shabbos candles and challah that the Medrash tells us about Sarah. So we have various different traditions that manifested itself. One can say that because they had the mystical understanding, they were able to apply it. But ultimately, those objects did not maintain holiness in them of itself, because the Torah had not yet been given. So they experienced the Torah on a deeper dimension. Even if they extrapolated it into some kind of practice, the physical objects did not become permeated with holiness. Yes.
Oh, question that. To understand the difference between Kaballah and Rabu, there's actually a text about Rabu, R-A-B-U. How do you say that?
I am not Rabu.
No, so it is.
Rabbo in Hebrew.
Thank you.
Rabbo is a possessive, his teacher. So there's an interesting, it says, I think it says Kol Rebbe mi Bavel, Kol Rav me Eretz Yisrael. I think it says that when we say in the Talmud, when we say Rebbe, it's a reference to a sage from Babylonia, if I'm not mistaken, and Rav is a reference to a sage from Israel. But the word Rav or Rabbi or Rebbe, in a general sense, these all contain a notion of a spiritual master, specifically around the teaching of Torah. We have something called a Rebbe, which when we talk about Hasidic masters, they're called Rebbe. And that's probably more of a Eastern European kind of expression than anything more. But in today's day and age, it's typically referred to in a very it's an overstatement, because in certain communities, when we were growing up, we called when I went to day school, our teachers were called Rebbe. We called our teachers Rebbe till today. I mean, my kids that go to day school, they call their teachers Rebbe. So Rebbe is it means teacher. If you grow up in a Yiddish environment, you're going to call your teacher Rebbe. Even if it's your first grade teacher, you're going to call him Rebbe. But outside of those communities in the broader world, Rebbe is a reference to a Hasidic master. Like the Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson was a Rebbe. Our Rebbes are called Rebbes. We refer to them as such. But some people will call them Rebbe anyway, just because it's an Americanized kind of way to refer to that. And a Rebbe in that context is more than just a teacher. It really is a spiritual channel, spiritual guide, a spiritual channel, a spiritual teacher, more than just a teacher of material of the Torah's teachings. It's the application of the Torah's teachings. It's a spiritual guide for how we live our lives and so on. That's it. Oh, the code. Thank you for bringing me back there. So the code is there's two things about the code. Number one, the code is very interesting, but and one can't discount the code, because the code is you can't discount it, but you can't validate it either. You can't discount it because it's pretty fascinating when you look at it. But it's ultimately computer generated. In other words, what they did was, with the advent of computers, they fed the Torah into the computer and they said, tell us interesting things. The cynics will say, if you feed Shakespeare into the computer, it will also tell you interesting things, right? There's enough variables that it will generate. It'll generate stuff that definitely can boggle the mind. So that's why you can't discount it, but neither can you, because it doesn't have a holy source, as I mentioned. So you can't either validate it and go to the bank with it. The kind of you might say the Chabad, I don't know that there's an official Chabad perspective on this, but there's a Chabad approach to Judaism and our relationship with God and our relationship with Torah and our efforts in outreach that the code is a deviation from, which is where the departure comes from. And that's as follows. Relationship with God is a transcendent, infinite, beyond comprehension relationship at its core. In other words, we can't comprehend God. No matter how much we'll study, no matter how great of a mystic you are. We learned this in a discourse yesterday in the morning, that even the greatest of teachers, the greatest of mystics, still use their brain to comprehend God. By definition, if you're using your physical brain, that's what's available, right? They're human beings. They may be very holy, may be very mystical. They may have had a glimpse of the other world, but they're at the end of the day, they're using their physical mind to comprehend an infinite God. So no matter how profound and how deep their comprehension is, it's living in a finite space. And God is infinite. So therefore, whatever they understand is not the thing. It's not the real deal. And we also discussed the idea of a parable, right? When you're studying an idea and you're accessing the idea, come on in. You're welcome to join us. When you're accessing an idea through a parable, what the student understands is the parable, not the idea. What the student extrapolates from the parable is the intellectual idea that's behind it, right? But you tell a story. The story is what the student hears. So what the student does is through the story, through the parable, the student then converts that themselves into the intellectual idea and then owns it. But ultimately, what the student is accessing is the parable. By the way, it says that King Solomon's greatness was that he was able to compose 3,000 parables on one idea of Torah. So you say, okay, that's great storyteller, right? What's so profound about that? I mean, that sounds like a lot of effort to come up with 3,000 parables on one idea. But what's so great about that? He was such a great storyteller. The idea is that in each parable, every detail of the parable perfectly aligned with the depth of the concept. So that's King Solomon, the wisest of all men, is that he can tell the story 3,000 ways, and every single time tell the story exactly as it's meant to be with all of its components. But what does the student have at the end of the day? The student has the parable. So our relationship with God, no matter how profound it's going to be, it's still going to be a parable. Because that's our access point. Go ahead.
I have to wonder regarding the brain connection that you mentioned. Isn't there a part of us that is not dependent on the brain? The trauma?
Good. 100%. I'm getting there. So my point is that when we try to access our relationship with God exclusively through the brain, we fall short. No matter how, my point is that no matter how great you are as a person, no matter how spiritual you are, no matter how mystical you are, no matter how pious you are, no matter how much you comprehend of Kaballah and Torah teachings, no matter what that is, that's not where the real relationship takes place. Because that's all finite. The relationship with God takes, and because God is infinite, so it can't fully take place there. So where does the relationship take place? It takes place on a soul level. By the way, this is also why the Baal Shem Tov was so invested in the simple Jew. Because the Baal Shem Tov said, you great scholars that profess to be better than the simple Jew, you're trying to profess your relationship with God through a finite means. This simple Jew who doesn't understand what you understand and yet chooses to do the mitzvah, right? Why is a mitzvah so important? Because a mitzvah bypasses the finite. Because God says to us, I want to have a relationship with you. How are we going to have this relationship? I'm going to tell you what I want, and you're going to do what I want, and that's how we have a relationship, right? That's the nature of relationships, right? You fall in love, right? At least let's say this from the man's vantage point. You fall in love, and you say, I want to marry you. I want to be in a relationship with you, right? The relationship lives at the core, right? Hopefully, right? If one is only marrying for surface reasons, that's going to be not a very profound relationship. But let's assume that you're really connecting with the other person. Where does that relationship live? it doesn't live at the core. It lives in action. You can't say, I love you deeply, but I never do anything for you. That's not a relationship. That's a feeling. If I really love you, then I do what you want. And that's where the connection takes place, right? The connection takes place in doing what I want, because my wanting, it lives at the core of who I am. What I want, my will, lies at the core of who I am. So if you fulfill my will, you are connecting with my core. If you understand me, that's great, but we're still not connecting, because you're not connecting with my core. You're connecting with my intellect. By the way, and relationships have many, many layers to it, right? You can have a business relationship that is the nature of the relationship is you bring some know-how, you bring some money, and together you build a company together. It doesn't mean you and I have any real profound connection to each other. We've chosen to, I bring this to the table, you bring that to the table, and it manifests itself collectively in the product. But you and I don't necessarily have a relationship. Okay, so that's one relation. Then you can be a musician, and I like your music, so I connect to your music. So in a sense, I'm connecting to you, but I'm not really connecting to you as an individual. I'm connected to your music. I'm reading the book on of course, I'm going to forget his name right now. Oh man. He went to Israel to play during the Yom Kippur War. I spoke about him on Yom Kippur. Leonard Cohen. So I'm reading the book which came out a couple months ago on Leonard Cohen and the Yom Kippur War. So he writes over there. It's very poetic. I won't do it justice to repeat it, but he writes about music being this tool of artistry that people mistaken for a relationship with the person themselves. He's cynical about it. Art is art. Art is an expression, but it's not the person themselves. That's how he kind of frames it. I'm not going to do it justice, but what I'm saying is there's other layers to a relationship. Then we can study together. So we share intellectual matter. If we're studying Torah, it's more spiritual matter. It's more than just intellectual matter, it's spiritual matter, and so on and so forth. But no matter where you go, you're still not at the core. When we do a mitzvah, we're fulfilling God's will. So we're connected with God's essence. So when you want to connect a Jew to Judaism, right? So the classic Chabad approach is light Shabbos candles, put on tefillin. Why? Why is that the first thing? Why don't you sit down and study some Torah? Start from the beginning. In the beginning, God created. Prove to me that there's a God. Prove to me that the Torah is real. Give me the depth of the meaning behind the mitzvot. Why isn't that the approach? Why is the approach do the action? Because if you want to access a Jewish soul, you bypass all the external layers. Go straight to the core. The core is found when you do a mitzvah. Once the person does a mitzvah, then they're connected. Once they're connected, then all the other stuff will happen. It'll happen at whatever level it's meant to happen. The attempt with the codes was to convince people intellectually about the truth of Torah as the starting point. And the problem with that is that if that's the starting point, then that's where the relationship lives. Right? If I'm only interested in the relationship because of the it's like a man who wants to date a woman only because she's beautiful or only because she's smart. If there's no emotional connection there, we're in trouble, right? You can't build a lifelong relationship between husband and wife, between male and female, that's based on intellect. It's wonderful if it's there. Yeah, hopefully it's there. It can't be based on physical looks either, because those things change, and it's also not that it's not important, but it's superficial, right? But if you and by the way, anybody who's been in a relationship knows that the relationship ultimately at its core is more profound than that. In fact, when there is a deeper relationship at a core, then all that other stuff gets magnified, right? If you truly connect with someone, she becomes beautiful. She becomes smart. She becomes, she's the best of everything, right? Because, or he is, because you connect at the core. So that's the danger of the codes. It's a different approach, but I think in a sense though, where the codes line up with gematria is on the cute side of gematria. It's not to say that any gematria you come up with doesn't have substance. You just gotta, it's gotta come from a good source to say that this is something I'm gonna take seriously. You start playing around with it, you're gonna find stuff, and some of the stuff will frighten you, some of the stuff will excite you, and all power to you. But to start saying this is a path in life because you found a gematria, that requires a holy source. Long answer to a short question.
It's an interesting Jewish concept, because I checked to be sure I was right. Billy Joel was a musician, or is a musician, and he married a woman named Christy Brinkley. And one of his songs, which I don't remember about, he says was summed up their relationship, which was what you said. She loved his music, she didn't love him.
Yeah.
He's Jewish.
Yeah. Some of the greatest were. There we go. Other questions?
Different.
Let's go for it.
Always try to use the 13 principles of Jewish faith. And the one with which I struggle is the resurrection of the body, because there's so many people who no longer have bodies. That's part of the question. And the other is, even if you resurrect the body, do we have souls that we get resurrected?
Yeah, great question. It's a complex question, and the Rebbe actually addresses some of what you asked in some letters. So the first thing we have to establish is that souls have many facets. Okay, it says that when God created the world, all souls were combined in Adam, and there are 600,000 primary souls. A soul is like a diamond. You've heard that analogy. But when you take a diamond and you shine a light through it, right, the light shines in myriads of ways. So, when people tell you, I remember an earlier life, that is actually not well founded in the teachings of Kaballah. People have notions and people have stuff, but it's not well founded in the teachings of Kaballah, because the dimension of your soul that exists in this lifetime was in a dormant state in your soul's consciousness in an earlier lifetime. Not only that, but you and I can belong to the same primary soul. We all could, it's very possible that we were all brought together in this room at this moment because we all belong to one particular primary soul. But your soul is not in me and my soul is not in you. But we are all the same, we are all manifestations of a primary soul, which, by the way, is not a difficult concept to understand. You can have multiple children, right? They're ultimately made from the same two parents, the same genetic material, but they look differently. If you break down the genes, you'll find you can eat, right? You're sitting on 23andMe, and suddenly you get an email, we just found your brother. My brother it actually happened. My brother in California signed up for 23andMe, and he sends me an email that he got from 23andMe. We found your brother. It was me. Because I had signed up to 23andMe, and I mean, not that he didn't know that I existed, right? 23andMe is you spit into a tube, and they will take your DNA and they'll analyze your DNA, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating what could be done with it. But they will identify your origins. Where's your family of origin from? Like which country? What percentage? There's a lot of crazy stories out there, stuff that happened. People found out that they weren't children of their parents and found lost siblings and stuff like that. All kinds of crazy stuff out there. I know firsthand of somebody who found a daughter that that he didn't know he had. He had a relationship with a woman for one night and discovered a daughter that he had. A crazy story. Anyway, but that's probably the less crazy of the stories that are out there. But and there's also amazing stuff that they can do from a medical standpoint, from medical science, how they can, they're as the genome has been mapped, they're able to identify different illnesses, different conditions that are more prone to certain DNA and ways to heal it. I mean, it's very fascinating. Anyway, but the idea is that they're primary souls, and primary souls have multiple manifestations. Each soul comes down to this, each manifestation of that soul comes down to this world for a unique purpose. And when that purpose is completed, we return back to God. That doesn't mean that every element of that primary soul has completed its mission. Some of those primary soul components have not come down to this earth, and some of them just are, haven't finished their job yet. So that's kind of very broad. There's a book by Rabbi Dov Ber-Pinson called Reincarnation in Judaism. It's a great book. It really kind of maps it out. Anyways, it's a good book. It's a hard read, but it's a good book. Now, specifically to the resurrection of the dead, let's first establish a question. Why is the resurrection of the dead one of the 13 principles of faith? Why do you think?
Yeah, but my mind, I've always found him to be perfectly logical, except in that one point I don't get it.
Okay, so let's explore that. Why do you think? Why would you imagine that the resurrection of the dead is such an important? Let me tell you what the resurrection of the dead is first. Okay, according to our tradition. According to our tradition, the world that God created, which Adam and Eve made a mess of, it's our job to clean it up. Okay, according to the mystics, that means that our job is to retrieve all the divine sparks that fell into the world. And we do that through using physical matter in the service of God and for a higher purpose and so on. And when that job is completed, then the world arrives to its state of perfection. And when that happens, we usher in the era of Mashiach, the Messianic era. Okay, what happens in the era of the Messianic era? Maimonides says that the occupation of the world will be to know God. There'll be no famine, no war. People live side by side at peace. And then there's a later stage, which is known as the time of Tchias HaMeis, and the time of the resurrection of the dead. And that is that all those that have lived before come back to life, and come back to life, bodies and soul. By the way, not everybody agree, and according to Maimonides, that's the ultimate. I'm sorry, according to Nachmanides, that's the ultimate. According to Maimonides, after that, the world as we know it ceases to exist, and it becomes just a world of souls. Nachmanides is not of that opinion. Nachmanides says that the ultimate is bodies and soul, and that's actually generally accepted amongst the Hasidic masters, amongst the Kabbalists, is the opinion of Nachmanides. Okay. But regardless, whether you hold like Nachmanides, whether you hold like Maimonides, the bottom line is that by all accounts, there's this period of time known as the resurrection of the dead. I'll tell you the answer, why it's so critical to Jewish thought that it's considered one of the principles of faith. God is just, and therefore, if God puts the soul into a body and puts the body through a journey of life on this earth, through a journey of struggle, and then takes the soul from the body and gives the soul the prize, he's not being just to the body. The body deserves a reward, right? The body is the one that went through the journey of life, did all the work. Think about it. Our souls are an energy force inside of us, but our bodies are the ones that actually have done all the work, are doing all the work. So that's just on what's known as schar v'onish, on a reward and punishment level. But it's more than that. It's the very purpose of creation, as we discussed, is about creating refinement in the world. If God didn't want transformation of a physical reality, he would never have created a physical reality. He would have kept the spiritual worlds. He created a physical reality for a very specific purpose, a very specific reason, because it's in this physical reality that God's essence is manifest. And when we're engaged in the physical world and we use it out in the service of God, right? I mean, I don't think you need a better time than the present for us in our lifetime, right? The world is a crazy place. It's a dark place. It's a cold place. It's a confusing place. And it's very easy to get lost in this world. And it's easy to lean into a lot of the mishagas that's out there, the voices that say this and the voices that say that. It's very easy to get lost in that. But if we anchor ourselves in God, then what we're basically saying is that God is present in all of this craziness. Doesn't mean we understand it, but we're bringing God into the reality. God's not somewhere else, and this world is devoid of godliness. This world is godly. Who's doing all that work? Where's that being manifest? It's being manifest inside of ourselves. I was coaching a rabbi. I do coaching for Chabad Shluchim. I was coaching a rabbi, and I said to him that you will not maximize your potential for success until you do the inner work of therapy. And he said to me, why? I study the Hasidic philosophy. I do the mitzvahs. I said, until you do the inner work, you got to go look at your past. You got to look at your childhood. You got to look at your triggers. You got to look at all that stuff. Until you do that, you're not going to be effective as you can be. And he said, why? I said, because who you are in your relationship with the world as a Jew, on a mission, is inextricably connected to who you are as a person. And who you are as a person is completely formulated by who you are in childhood, your genetic makeup, your parents that raised you, the culture within which you grew up. And if you're not willing to look at that, then you're not fully present, right? We're not just the outer layer. We're made up of multiple complex layers, some of which we're aware of and many of which we are not aware of. You spend some time in therapy, you get to know yourself better. The more you get to know yourself, the more you're able to bring yourself to the conversation, to your work in this world. So who's doing all that work? The body's doing that work of bringing a consciousness of God into the world. So what are you saying? You're saying the body comes down to this world, does all the work is manifest in the body, and then the body never gets to experience the result of that? It's not just the body doesn't get to experience it, the world never experiences. The body is supposed to be alive with the light that it is presently concealing, right? So when Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they saw the godliness around them. That's what they saw. They saw in the physical matter the godly light. Through the sin, they created concealment. Our job is to go back to that state of being, but not as angelic beings, but as human beings, to be able to see the godliness in the experience. So that's why it's one of the 13 principles of faith. Now, to the final question, this is the one that the Rebbe addresses specifically. Which body gets the soul? And what happens to those bodies that are no longer, they're decomposed, and God forbid if bodies have been massacred and burned and so on and so forth. So ultimately, with today's science, at least from one angle, we understand that there's always matter of DNA there. And the matter of DNA always has the capacity to remap the whole body. So we'll let God figure the specifics, but even if there's not an actual body, the DNA never is fully goes away. No, it's just a rebuilding from that core. Whatever that means. Yeah, it could be.
That is one body.
No, one body has it's one body with one soul. It's many bodies with one soul. So that's answered by the answer before, that each soul has many facets. And each soul receives one unique facet of that primary soul. You and I can't have the same facet of the same primary soul, because there's only one that belongs to me, one belongs to you. We belong to the same primary soul. It's like all of your children have DNA in common, but they also have unique DNA, right? The DNA that they have in common is is that they can all source themselves to a single set of parents, but they each have their own unique manifestation of that. So in a similar way, each soul, each person that has lived has a unique spiritual DNA, and therefore that unique spiritual DNA is unique to you, the individual, and doesn't belong to the other one. So multiple people who have lived that have manifestations of the same primary soul, each will have their unique facet. It says in Kaballah that each primary soul has 613 facets, and each of those 613 have 613 facets. You do the math. That's a lot of souls. All right, next Sunday, we regroup, fresh, new discourse on Israel, spread the word. Looking forward to picking it up and having an amazing 2024.